And I'm going to take a note from Mark's book, and I'm going to try and define conceptual engineering right at the beginning, as I understand it in privacy's context. And what I'm trying to do, this is part of my doctoral research, and as Manuel kindly mentioned, also a forthcoming publication. So your feedback is very welcome. What I'm trying to do here is to make privacy more relevant and more contemporary. I'm trying to give it an expansive interpretation which works in the age of big data analytics and COVID-19 apps. So to set up the problem, I think we can work with this example. Some of you may be familiar with this article. When it came out, it caused quite an uproar. And the incident that it talks about went on something like this, that in Minneapolis in 2011, an angry father reached out to a superstore Target, and he was angry because his daughter, who at that time was in high school, was receiving targeted advertisement for pregnancy related products, and that really shocked him. So the store manager apologized, and everybody thought that was the end of the matter. The manager called back a week later to apologize again, but this time the father apologized. It so happened that his daughter was pregnant, but he just was not aware of it. Now, this raised some remarkable questions from privacy perspectives, that how could a superstore find out about someone's pregnancy before their own family? The more scary fact was what they did fell within the norms of boundaries. What they did not, strictly speaking, violate privacy law. This helps me set up the problem, because the concept of privacy as it has been traditionally understood, I mean, I can restructure this talk and call it what would have happened if lawyers and philosophers would have worked together 130 years back, because the privacy model that we have right now is based on this. So this is from what is termed as the most famous law review article ever written, The Right to Privacy by Warren and Brandeis in Harvard Law Review in 1890. And they defined the right to privacy as the right to be let alone. And that has formed the foundation of privacy discourse as we understand it today. For the purposes of today's talk, I'll be focusing only on informational privacy, which I understand as an individual's right to have control over over information. And when I speak about big data analytics, I mean it in terms of deployment of analytic strategies to big data sets in order to discover hidden patterns, hidden correlations. And when I speak about COVID-19 apps, I have in mind the contact tracing apps, which have been introduced by various countries in the wake of the pandemic as part of the public health surveillance mechanism. So these are some of the key definitions. I'm not putting them on the slides. We can talk about that more later. But what has happened because of Warren and Brandeis' definition of right to be let alone, that in context of informational privacy, privacy has been limited in many jurisdictions to what is considered as personally identifiable information. Now, when I discussed this talk with Manuel, Manuel said that it would be interesting if you can bring in some of the legal insights or the regulatory perspectives, or share some of the challenges in conceptual engineering from that perspective. And so towards that end, the following challenges are the ones that I wish to discuss today. So the first challenge, if we understand protecting an individual's privacy in terms of protecting an individual only from identification, and that to just personal identification, then that's a very constricted notion of privacy. Uh, let's take an intuitive example. If I'm walking on the street of St. Andrews, somebody who does not know me can still infer a lot of information about me just by the way I look, my gender, my nationality, and many other attributes about me, right? We share information voluntarily and involuntarily all the time. Now, if the purpose of privacy is only to anonymize information, and that to only personal information such as social security number, passport details, and so on and so forth, then that's really not meaningful in today's context, when the more important and the more salient feature of privacy should be focused on a person's social identity. Now, a person's social identity is the sense of self that a person derives on the basis of his or her or their membership in a social group. Now, if we exclude this monumental aspect of a person's identity from privacy protection, we're obviously doing a great disservice. Now, different jurisdictions approach this differently. Europe includes social identity, US excludes social identity, but even the level of regulation is different. Now, if we go back to the example of the Target store targeting somebody with specific ads, we realize a scary fact that today we may be not identifiable, but we may be still reachable. And what that I think somebody needs to, okay, yeah, great, that's taken care. Thanks. And what that means is that for all practical purposes, our autonomy gets compromised even if we remain anonymized, so to speak. So let's say because my IP address is anonymized, my web data is anonymized, but if on the basis of my profiling history, I'm being algorithmically discriminated in jobs, if I'm denied social benefits or housing benefits, then that privacy protection is meaningless. So that's why we need to conceptually engineer privacy in order to make it more relevant for the age of big data analytics and COVID-19 apps. Now, this problem has been sought to be identified with the help of a concept called group privacy. And Lynn Taylor and Floridi and many others have argued that individual is no longer at the center of privacy violations. When we are looking at privacy violations, what we are more concerned with are the group formations. They may be social groups, they may be algorithmic groups, but we are no longer individual. We are no longer interested in the individual for the purposes of data collection or data processing. But the problem is, for the purposes of regulation, the individual is still the locus of privacy. So while the violation has moved on, while the processing has moved on, the regulation still focuses on the individual. All right. Now, I want to spend some time on what is group right to privacy, but in order to set up this properly, different scholars have different views on group right to privacy. The people who support it, they view it at least in two ways. So somebody like Blaustein, when he writes in 1978, and not in the age of big data analytics, but in a more social context, he views group privacy as an extension of individual privacy. When Floridi and others, they look at group privacy, they look at it as a right of the group itself. So there are at least two ways in which we can understand group privacy. But which view is correct, right? Now, before I tell you more about this, I want to rely on somebody's opinion, which I think all of us will agree knows a bit about privacy, and it is Snowden. In his famous interview to Guardian in 2014, uh, and this really is the guiding principle for my research, Snowden says we need to recognize that people have an individual right to privacy, but they also have a collective right to privacy. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not aware of many things to which people both have an individual right, but also have a collective right. Uh, but if Snowden is saying that, I'm very happy to follow his advice on that. And in order to give you a real world example of this, I want to show you something which is from the pages of the brochure of Cambridge Analytica's presentation, which was part of their presentation for the Leave EU campaign. If you can see this and if it's legible, you will be hard pressed to find the word individual here. And this entire slide is bombarded with groups. So if for all psychometric analysis purposes, if for all behavioral targeting purposes, all that matters is group, then can we still be protected as individuals in a world where the regulation is targeted at the individual level? So I think that's a significant challenge from conceptual engineering purposes. Now let's take a step back. Right. So we are still at group right to privacy. I just want to be aware of the time. Right. Okay. Now, So I was telling you that at least we can understand group right privacy in two sense. One is as an extension of the individual privacy, and another as right of the group itself. And there's a peculiar problem here. Now, usually when we talk about group rights, we understand them to be as right of the group. Peter Jones and others, they are very clear about that, that when we're trying to identify group right, we should look at the subject of the right, not the object of the right, and the subject of the right is the group. So it should only be a group interest which formulates a group right. There are some exceptions to this, like Kimlicka and McDonald and others, who say that we can also have group rights which arise on the basis of membership in a group. But the problem is, group privacy since its initiation has been identified as an attribute of the members of the group. So if group privacy is an attribute of the members, but group right is right of the group, then what is group right to privacy? And I think the solution to that, and I don't think Snowden was trying to solve a conceptual problem, but I think Snowden presents a very elegant solution to this. And he says that you should understand privacy both in the individual context, and I would argue this individual context is in terms of the membership in groups, and also as a group right to privacy. So let that be the beginning of our understanding. Some of the other challenges that we need to account for here. How do we account for privacy dependencies? And what I mean by that is that in the age of big data analytics, we all belong together in social and algorithmic groups, whether we know about it or not, whether we like it or not. So, for example, let's say uh, Manuel and I buy the same brand of shoes and read the same books, and we use Amazon to buy all our products. Then we may be algorithmically grouped on the basis of our shopping preferences, and we may be receiving the same targeted ads. Now, but do we know that we are part of those groups? Well, probably not. And how do we protect our privacy interests in this regard? And what is more scary is that then my data can be used to violate Manuel's privacy and vice versa. So the individual interest and the group interests are not sharply delineated as they may be in context of other rights. The sixth challenge for conceptual engineering would be to resolve the privacy versus access trade-off. Uh, the business model that most of us have grown used to is of free access to the internet, and the commercial side of it is said to be justified on the basis of advertisement, that you access a website and in exchange for your data, the targeted ads that you receive, you get access to the free services, so to speak. Now, is that a fair trade-off? Are we aware of that trade-off? Is that a trade-off which can work in the longer run? Those are some of the issues that we need to address. And lastly, from the COVID-19 apps perspective, how would privacy look in the longer run? I won't probably be able to answer all of these questions. Some of the answers are there in the paper, but I'm just setting up the challenges that we have for privacy in the present day and age. Right. So this is what my research hopes to show privacy is in today's day and age. And my apologies, you'll be staring at this slide for the rest of the presentation. So please get used to it. Uh, when I when I started studying the evolution of privacy between the individual right and the group right, there was a very interesting transition state where scholars such as Priscilla Regan and others started arguing for privacy to be also lauded for its social value. And they said that privacy is not just an individual right, but it also has social value. And I think there is a lot of merit in that. What I would try to add to that is that what I term as PV, which is privacy as a social value, that privacy not only has a social value, it is a social value. It's a value that we share socially. It's an interest that we work towards as a society. It's an interest which forms the bedrock of our social interactions. And at this stage, I want to suggest a strategy for resolving the false dichotomy between individual and group privacy by saying that the reason this dichotomy has arisen is because of our limited understanding of what an individual is. Privacy scholars do not agree on many things, including the definition of privacy. But one aspect which most privacy scholars agree on is that the function of privacy is to protect individual identity and autonomy. Now, the question is, what is identity and autonomy? I've already suggested to you that we should also focus on social identity and not just the personal identity. So there, the individual becomes part of the group. That's Henry Taffel's work on social identity. But in terms of autonomy, we don't want an autonomy where if right now I'm in this room, I'm sequestered and I'm sheltered from the world, I'm autonomous. I want an autonomy where I'm a socially embedded member of the society, and those relationships that form my socially autonomous self are protected by privacy. So this fragmentation which has happened between individual and group privacy, that I'm arguing has happened because of our limited understanding of what it means to be an individual. We can go into historic reasons for that, how the theory has evolved, but we don't have time for that. But I'll give you with one limited submission on that. When Dyke says that this error perhaps occurs on the basis of social contract theory and perhaps even Rawls' veil of ignorance, where the individual is considered to be an island and the only people who are endowed with rights are either the individual or the state, and the social groups are disenfranchised. So perhaps that's where the error is. Now, if you agree with these submissions in terms of privacy as a social value and the enhanced role of the individual, then I want to take you to the first group right that I have in mind, which is GRP1. So I'll quickly take you to the model here. What I have in mind is that privacy as a social value paves way for individual right to privacy, and also two forms of group right to privacy at the individual level and two forms of group right to privacy at the group level. So GRP1 is the right of is the group right to privacy enjoyed by the individual on the basis of their membership in a social group. This is a positive right. GRP2 is a negative right. It's a right against algorithmic grouping, again enjoyed by the individual. GRP3 is the right of the group, an organized group, as Catherine Ritchie in a classification of feature groups and organized groups in social ontology of groups tells us, is right of certain groups to enjoy privacy. And GRP4 is mutual privacy. I'll explain all of them individually, but just setting this up for you. So GRP1, then throughout all of this, what I would be working with is the Razian theory of interest. And if I am right in asserting that that an individual has interest in protecting her social identity, then this should serve as sufficient moral weight against any kind of onslaught of big data analytics and any kind of commercial interest that they may have in terms of profiling an individual for behavioral targeting purposes. So let's take an example. Let's say I have a social media account and I have any kind of political views. It may be right wing, left wing, but I belong to a social media community on the basis of my groups. Now, the creation of epistemic bubbles or echo chambers, which happen on social media, impede the formation of my social identity. If I want to enter into a more nuanced debate, like some of the contentious topics that we discussed yesterday in a controlled environment, as was suggested, which is necessary for conceptual engineering, that cannot happen online. Now, in this regard, sorry, is there something at the chat that I need to look at? I got distracted by that. No, okay, perfect, thank you. Now, in this regard, if big data analytics is impeding the formation of my social identity, then there is a corresponding obligation on them that they should be restricted. How does this work from a COVID-19 app perspective? Well, Parker and others at Oxford have set up the ethical dilemma very nicely in terms of COVID-19 apps. That if we can reasonably show that by virtue of restricting privacy, we can reduce suffering in terms of preventing lockdowns or deaths, then that's a trade off which we should perhaps accept. And I think that's perhaps a reasonable position. What I'm more concerned about is the post pandemic effect of this kind of surveillance, because we now know that anytime there is a crisis and there's a surveillance mechanism which is introduced, it is almost never rolled back. So far, I have not heard anything in terms of whether the COVID-19 apps are their efficacy, whether they would last after the pandemic, what would happen to the data set which has been created. And I would argue this leaves an individual in a state of simulated surveillance, simveillance. This is a term which was coined by William Bogart in 1996, but I'm using it in a slightly different context. And what I mean by that is that if surveillance becomes an integral part of formation of an individual social identity, and if we have no way of ruling out that that surveillance has ceased to exist, then the individual continue to simulate that surveillance and continue to form her social identity as if the surveillance is present. So right now, if I want to go to a restaurant, I need to have a COVID-19 app, or I need to give out my details in order to get access to a public place, which is an integral part of my social formation of my social identity. Now, this trade-off might be necessary during the course of the pandemic, but once the pandemic is over, what happens to the collected data? That is a question we need answer to. From GRP2 perspective, this right is steeped in right to information self-determination, which was recognized by the German Federal Supreme Court in 1983, December 1983, and it was a case involving census for electoral purposes, if I remember correctly. And what the court said was that an individual has a right to determine for himself what information they want to share in what context. So this can be readily understood in terms of contextual integrity, as Nissenbaum has highlighted, that if I have some sensitive medical information, I may not be comfortable that to be shared in a professional setting. Now, what information I share where is an integral part of my identity formation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the reason why we are in the present situation, we have been overtly focusing on privacy's role in identification and not in identity formation. So if I lose control over this vital aspect, that what information I'll share where, then my right to self-determination gets violated. Now, when I'm algorithmically grouped against my, even with my consent, because I do not understand that consent, I do not understand all those uses. And let me give you an example of that. There is a well-regarded psychometric analysis papers. I'm going to change my view so that I can see most of you. Quick show of hands, people who like curly fries. People who like curly fries. Awesome. Uh, Congratulations, all of you have higher IQ than the rest of us who do not like curly fries, because now there are psychometric analysis papers who have come to that conclusion, and it may sound interesting in itself, but it's scary when you think of it in terms of if you're discriminated on a job basis on the basis of that, or if Cambridge Analytica or a similar company can use those tools to then decide your political inclinations and so on and so forth. The difference between my approach and the approach of other scholars in this regard is that other scholars have tried to stop this problem downstream, that what kind of inferences are being drawn. And my concern with that approach is that we do not know all the inferences that can be drawn and all the abuses of that data. So our reasonable bet at stopping this is to prevent algorithmic grouping in the first place. So that's the submission as regards GRP2. Again, during the course of the pandemic, this does not prevent contact tracing, but in the post-pandemic usage, there would be restrictions. Uh, right, I want to finish my talk in another 5 minutes so that we have more time for questions. So quickly moving on to GRP3 and GRP4. Now, Kraft and others have identified group right in two contexts. One is right of the members of the group, and second is that of the group itself. I think that ties very neatly with the distinction that Catherine Ritchie and others have drawn in terms of social ontology of groups, in terms of feature groups and organized groups. So when I think of feature groups, I so when I think of feature groups, I think of them in terms of individuals' rights arising on the basis of their membership in the group. And when I think of organized groups such as this, uh, I do you think our privacy was just violated? I don't think. I think it was a welcome interruption. For this organized group, I mean, so do all organized groups have an interest in privacy? That is one question we need to firstly address. I would say perhaps not. Not just, it depends upon the nature of the group and it depends upon the nature of the activity. So let's look at some examples. Let's think of uh, lifeboat rescuers. Uh, uh, and they are working against the stated policy of a country which is anti-refugee, and they're trying to rescue maroon refugees at the sea. Now, it is in the interest of such a group that their privacy rights are being protected, because the harm which is suffered here is not just at the level of the individual member, but it's for the group itself, right? And we need not have such dramatic examples. Right now, we are freely sharing our research, this is getting recorded, but there's a built-in expectation of privacy that the whosoever is the moderator will make sure that this is being conducted in a congenial manner, and whosoever, and there would not be any unwarranted interruptions in here. So even within the confined spaces of this virtual group, there is an interest in privacy. Now, in order to delineate this group interest in privacy, the following desideratum would be required: that there's a group, it has an interest in privacy, this will not be protected by any other individual interest or any other group interest, and only then we can say that this is a group right to privacy, right? Uh, Keeping in line with Snowden's suggestion, I think this can be used to supplement individual privacy. So there has been a lot of venom spread in name of pandemic, and you can see in all over the world, these super spreader events have been used to malign minorities and their religious groups. Now, in normal circumstances, if it's a prayer meet or a religious group which is meeting, as an organized group, they are entitled to their right to privacy, and you would say that, well, we cannot infringe upon that. But during the course of the pandemic, perhaps we can make a limited time exception, but again, post-pandemic usage should not be permitted. That would be the argument made in GRP 3. Last argument as regards GRP 4 is regarding the collective interest in privacy. And the argument here is on the following lines. It's the world that we are living in, there's a great degree of probability that we belong together, whether in an algorithmic group or in a social group, which means that my privacy is not protected unless your privacy is protected. We have a collective interest in privacy. Fairfield and Engels have called privacy as a public good, and I think that's a wonderful starting point to 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 take this home. And if we are able to devise privacy as a collective right, where we all have a mutual interest, then I think we can see some dramatic changes in terms of legislation. Now, towards this end, what I have done is I have coined a concept which I call mutual privacy. And in conclusion, that is where I want to take you. So I'm just going to sum up everything that I've said so far, and I'm going to take you towards mutual privacy. Right. So in this talk, what I've argued for is recognition of privacy as a social value. I've suggested that the limitation and definition of privacy arises out of a limited conception of the individual. If the aim of privacy is to protect an individual's identity and autonomy, then it cannot be limited to the personal identity and the classic liberal self. And we need to break this false dichotomy which is crept in between individual and group privacy. If privacy has to remain meaningful, then it must extend to the social identity of the individual and the socially embedded autonomous self. An individual has an interest in protecting their social identity arising out of their participation in social groups, the panoptic sorting, which is on the basis of behavioral targeting of individuals by big data analytics for behavioral targeting purposes, gives rise to epistemic bubbles and echo chambers that impede the formation of an individual's social identity. And an individual has an interest against the algorithmic grouping. This is GRP2. GRP3 is where groups can have certain rights to privacy. And lastly, I want to share with you my thoughts on mutual privacy. Right, so this is what mutual privacy is. I've already covered the first two parts with you. The important part that I want to leave you with is that the greater privacy you will have, the more privacy I will have. Our privacy is not only interdependent in nature, it is existentially cumulative and cumulatively interlinked. It increases in force with each successive protection. Counterintuitive as it may sound, in the age of big data analytics, privacy is something which we have more together. I'm very grateful for your time. I understand interdisciplinary research presents arguments in very different way than philosophers are used to. So I apologize for any inconvenience in this regard, but I hope you liked some of the thoughts that I shared with you. Thank you so much for your time.